This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Iran's Mirror news agency reporting President Ebrahim Raisi and the foreign minister have been killed in a helicopter crash. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman postpones a planned trip to Japan over concerns for King Salman's health. Plus, Asian stocks rally as China moves to shore up its property market. Investors bracing for another busy week of earnings, headlined by AI darling Nvidia. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. We are keeping a close eye on the developments out of Iran, with the semi-official news agency Mirror confirming just a short while ago that the Iranian president, Mr. Raisi, has indeed died in that helicopter crash. We will be bringing you more analysis and coverage out of the region in a couple of moments. But before we get to that main breaking news story, I just want to do a quick wrap-up of how markets have fared over the course of the last trading day. So you can see the S&P closed up slightly firm on this session on Friday, up about 0.1%, piercing through 5,300, another key psychological level to the upside. 10-year yields also in focus, trading around flat, 4.41% is where we're at. A lot of love going into some of the precious metals. You can see that copper, not a precious metal, but industrial metal, up 3%, copper up 25% for the year now, as some of the supply concerns start being factored into that industrial metal. But of course, the more broader complex picture for metals has been quite positive as well. Gold, 2,400, up 0.9%, an all-time high for gold, as the market starts to price in further rate cuts out of the Fed, a weaker USD, and of course, safe haven, given everything else that's going on in the world. A quick check also on the VIX. I thought this was interesting too. Look, we have broken below 12. This is actually the lowest close for VIX, that is the volatility index for the S&P, since the pandemic. Very low levels indeed. And we talk about some of the geopolitical risk premium that's building into markets that's not really being priced into volatility markets, hence why the VIX has been dropping so much. So interesting. It is closed below 12 for the first time since the pandemic. But let's switch over and talk about how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio, standing by as ever. Avril.
Yeah, Jumana, we're actually seeing Asia stocks starting to, I think, pare back some of the earlier optimism at the start of the session. It was, all things considered, a pretty good handover that we got from U.S. stocks as they eked out those fresh records. And then don't forget, of course, we also had China coming through that property rescue package. So there was a lot of optimism at the start of the session, but I think that caution is creeping in. We're seeing the developers in Hong Kong under pressure today, snapping their winning streak as investors, I think, focus on how that rescue package is going to be implemented and how it's also really not big enough to support the real estate sector. Let's flip the board because we're not just seeing the Hong Kong gauge, the Hang Seng pairing some of the earlier gains. The Nikkei is doing that as well, although the sectors that we're really keeping an eye on today amid the geopolitical developments, the oil counters in Japan, those are really the ones that are lifting the gauges in the country, Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much. And that was a big story on Friday. No wonder that we are seeing still reaction in some of these Chinese markets this morning as well. On to our top news of the day. Iran's Mirror news agency says President Ebrahim Raisi and the country's foreign minister have been killed in a helicopter crash. Emergency crews earlier reported seeing wreckage after hours of complicated search efforts. Our Middle East economy and government editor Paul Wallace joins us for the latest. Well, the news was coming thick and fast over the course of the evening. It wasn't until about 10 minutes ago that the semi-official Iranian state TV actually confirmed that the president has been killed. This is a huge moment, but just describe to us what we know and how this news came about.
Hi, Jumana. Well, this crash happened at around midday yesterday in a mountainous area of the northwest of the country when Raisi and other officials, including Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian, were coming back from the border with Azerbaijan. There was a lot of confusion initially. Iranian state media was describing it variously as a crash and a hard landing. it became clear that it was, in fact, a crash and things were not looking good late last night. It was very difficult for the rescue teams. As I said, this was a mountainous area. The weather was not good. There was a lot of fog. The crash site was located sometime early this morning, and then around 2-3 hours ago, Iranian state media said there was no sign of life at the crash site, which I think was the first real sign that the president had probably died, and that's something that the semi-official state news agency has just confirmed.
So President Raisi was seen as a protege and a potential successor to the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei. What happens next? What are the next steps?
That is a big question. The government itself has not put out an official statement yet saying, for example, who now takes over. It's likely to be the senior vice president, someone who's called Mohamed In some ways, a lot of what's gone on in Iran in the last couple of years in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of the proxies, in terms of tensions with Israel and the US, were not down to Raisi so much as the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He obviously remains in position. Yesterday, he was tweeting, urging Iranians to show calm, and said that whatever happened, whatever the outcome was of this crash, that things would remain stable. It's likely that there will have to be an election within about 50 days. Most analysts don't think that Mokhber, the vice president, will remain in that position beyond those elections, that it will be someone else. We'll have to see who, and obviously people will be watching very closely to see if the front runners that emerge in the election are also ultra-conservative clerics like Raisi was.
Who has spearheaded many of those projects in the last couple of years and is seen as one of the more hawkish and hard-leaning presidents that have come out of the Iranian regime in the last decade. So
exactly.
Something that we need to watch out for. Paul, thank you so much for bringing us the commentary around this big story today. Our Middle East and economy and government editor, Paul Wallace. Now, Japan's government has confirmed that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has postponed a planned 4-day trip to Japan. That's as his father, King Salman, is due to receive treatment at the palace for a lung inflammation, according to the state-run Saudi press agency. Now, for more, Christine Burke, our Saudi bureau chief, joins us from Riyadh. Christine, we know that the Crown Prince was meant to be going to Japan for a state visit, but of course the plans changed. What do we know about the king's health at this point?
Well, Jumana, what we know and what we can say for sure this morning is that the king's health has been deteriorating over the last 24 hours. The concerns really started yesterday morning when Saudi press agency reported that the king was undergoing medical checks at the Al Salam Royal Palace in Jeddah due to a high fever and also as he was suffering from joint pain. Fast forward to overnight, and we got another statement saying that the king is now receiving antibiotics for lung inflammation. And this all comes as MBS was due to visit Japan. Now, we don't know very much more at this point in time about the king's health, and we don't want to speculate, of course, on what may happen from here, but we are on high alert for any deterioration, any worsening of his health condition, because that may just suggest that we, are looking at a possible Saudi succession plan. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman handles most of the day-to-day operations in Saudi Arabia as it stands now, and he is next in line to the throne.
What was the purpose, anyway, of the Crown Prince going to Japan at this point? Christine, I know he was also doing a bit of a tour of the region over the weekend. Interesting to note that he met with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. But what was the aim of the Japan trip?
Well, look, we know that Japan and Saudi Arabia have been forging deeper ties. We heard this morning, as you said, from the Japan side of things, that MBS has had to postpone this 4-day trip that was planned. During this 4-day trip, he was due to meet with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Japanese media had also reported that the Crown Prince would have met with Japanese companies, and it was also said that there was going to be some sort of agreement on liquid hydrogen. Now, it's worth noting that this would have been MBS's first trip to Japan since 2019. He was actually due to visit Japan in late 2022, but had to cancel that trip as well. And again, in the context here, really, these are two countries that have been forging deeper ties. Kishida was here in Saudi Arabia in July of 2023, and the countries announced deeper collaboration on green energy and also on technology. So we assume that had this trip gone ahead this week, green energy and technology would have been two key areas of focus. I also just want to make one final point that while we don't know now, of course, when MBS may visit Japan again, Japan has said that there will be discussions around a potential rescheduling of this trip.
Christine, as ever, thank you so much for joining us. That was Christine Burke, our Saudi bureau chief in Riyadh. Well, tensions are rising within Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's three-man war cabinet. His two senior deputies are pressing him to shift course in their war against Hamas. Bloomberg's Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, who heads our Middle East, North Africa and Russia coverage, joins us now for more. The commentary of the weekend, I thought, from Benny Gantz was really interesting. He was saying that he would like to see the Prime Minister shift course on Gaza or he would quit. Really breaking ranks here, isn't he?
He is, but we kind of knew it was coming. So we know the tension's been there for a long time. They weren't exactly best friends to start with. Fundamentally, though, it doesn't appear to change very much. It definitely adds tension to the existing problem. But the reality is, if he walks out of the war cabinet, Bibi still has a majority in the Knesset. It looks like the ultra-conservatives are very unlikely to walk away from the coalition because if they do, they effectively lose power. And based on all the polling that we can see now, yes, Gantz would get into office, so they would effectively get out of office. So they're not going to self-immolate, basically.
But the criticism is growing louder and louder, and this isn't, the comments of Benny Gantz didn't come in a vacuum. Towards the end of the week last week, I thought it was really interesting. The Defense Minister, Gallant, also said that he had serious concerns about what the plan was for Gaza post-war. And it seems to me that, the walls are beginning to turn in a little bit on the Prime Minister. How damaging is that going to be for him to be able to continue with the war efforts? I
mean, I would argue that Bibi's already pretty damaged, and that damage has unfolded over several months. And it is also true to say that there really isn't a plan for post-war Gaza. So we know there's been discussions going on trying to build some sort of coalition, particularly amongst the Arab countries, that will be effectively a caretaker security force in Gaza until you can get something resembling a Palestinian administration with any credibility. But there is a great reluctance among the Arab states to do that because they know that once they get involved, where exactly is the endgame? What guarantees are there that you will end up with something resembling a two-state solution or indeed a credible Palestinian administration of any sort whatsoever? So it feels like everyone is trying to avoid the issue.
Yeah, I mean, Benny Gantz threatened that if his six-point proposal hasn't been met by June the 6th, then he would quit. So it seems like June the 6th could be another potential date to watch out for in the future there. Yeah,
and the analysts that we spoke to yesterday have said that sort of a little bit of a misfire. I think the quote was along the lines of, if you're going to shoot, you shoot now. You don't give a 3 weeks heads up for someone to basically rally a defence.
Yeah. Stuart, thank you so much. That was Bloomberg's Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, who heads our Middle East, North Africa and Russia coverage with the latest on what's been happening with Israel over the past weekend. Also coming up on our show, hear why Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohamed El-Erian thinks the Fed is running the risk of making a mistake in pursuing the 2% inflation goal. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, we are monitoring the information that is coming out of Iran. A short while ago, the semi-official news agency Mir confirmed that the Iranian president was killed in the helicopter accident overnight, in addition to the foreign minister. And now we are also getting information from Al-Alam saying that all 9 members on the helicopter have been pronounced dead as well. Al-Alam also being another semi-official state agency network. This has all just come to light in the last 10 to 15 minutes as the search for the wreckage of the helicopter continued way into the late hours of the night, early into the hours of the morning. They found the wreckage site just about an hour ago and have now confirmed that everyone on board that helicopter has now died. Well, switching on to markets, Bloomberg opinion columnist and Queen's College Cambridge President Mohamed El-Erian says the Fed's delay of rate cuts to temper inflation runs the risk of falling behind the curve. He says it's the real economy, not inflation, that will force the central bank to pivot.
I think the big issue right now is that we as a profession and we as a market are too influenced by what happened after the global financial crisis. We believe somehow still in the back of our mind that low interest rates, very low interest rates, are the norm, not the exception. We believe that inflation is not an issue. So look what has happened to the Fed. The Fed pivoted on the basis of data. It was the opposite of the pivot they did in December when they pivoted on basis. Now they have to do a U-turn. As they're doing the U-turn and say higher for longer, the market is going the other way. So you saw what happened to the 2-year, you saw what happened to the 10-year. And then there are two really problematic issues that we don't talk enough. How sensitive are the stubborn components of inflation to interest rates? They're not very sensitive. That's problem number one. Problem number two, what indications are we getting of the economy? It's slowly weakening. So it raises the issue that once again, the Fed is going to have to pivot, this time not on the basis of the inflation numbers, but on the basis of the real economy numbers. It will pivot yet again. And then there's the big issue that I know no one wants to discuss.
Go on.
And I insist, I understand that fully, is the inflation target the right target? We all talk about wanting to go back to 2%. Every single quote you had this morning assumes that 2% is the right inflation target. 2% is totally arbitrary. But I understand why no one wants to talk about this. But we should all realize that if we are pursuing the wrong inflation target, the risk of a mistake, and that mistake would mean sacrificing growth unnecessarily, the risk of that mistake is high, especially when the low-income people are most at risk.
Interesting comments there from Bloomberg opinion columnist and Queen's College Cambridge President Mohamed El-Erian, raising an existential question about that inflation target put forward by central banks. We've always assumed that it's 2%, but he's suggesting that maybe that 2% is an arbitrary number and needs to be revised. So something to think about as we head into what looks like will be another 6 months of potential rate cuts out of the Fed. Well, still ahead, we will get the market outlook with the Equiti Group as robust earnings help power the bull run in U.S. stocks. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, the bull run in U.S. stocks has been powering ahead on the back of resilient corporate earnings and bets on Fed rate cuts this year. The 4 major indices all notching gains in the last 4 weeks. But will it continue? That is the big question for investors. Let's bring in Nadia Bilassy, market analyst at Equiti Group. Good morning to you, Nadia.
Good morning.
I noted that the S&P broke through 5,300 towards the end of the week last week. The big question, of course, is do you expect this bull run to continue?
Yes, actually, from Equiti, we're very bullish when it comes to equities because we think that it is sustainable for the bull run to continue, whether it's earnings seasons. Even Q1 earnings season surpassed analyst expectations. Yes, 61% missed out on revenue. We can see that revenue is lagging. However, I think the big theme is that companies are still getting strong. Revenues are lagging because they are cost-cutting when it comes to employees, which is something very normal to see.
Yeah. What about NVIDIA? That's the big one this week that people are watching out for. How much of the direction of travel from here onwards is going to be determined by what NVIDIA come out with this week?
I don't think we should underestimate any of the companies that are AI or semiconductor. These are like the sectors that we're actually focusing on when it comes to stocks and equities. Big part of it is tech, even in China tech. So I think with all eyes on NVIDIA, I think if earnings and the forward guidance surpass expectations, then we're definitely going to see another boost in the stock market.
Yeah, I just wonder if it doesn't meet expectations, then what happens? Because there seems to be a lot of optimism already baked into some of these valuations.
That's true, but NVIDIA is not the only barometer for the equity market's bull run. There's a lot of other supporting factors. I think it should play a big role, but I think the bull run will continue either way.
Okay. What about, we spoke about the micro. What about the macro? And again, coming back to what's priced in or not priced into the Fed rate curve. I checked this morning, there's about 40 basis points of rate cuts priced in. Obviously, people were quick to price in more once that CPI number came in slightly softer than expectations. But again, to what extent is the direction of travel also underpinned by markets' expectations for rate cuts this year?
I think definitely the number one theme is rate cuts. I think it's actually overshadowing earnings season. Rate cuts, it's producing so much optimism in the market for a September cut. And I think after Powell's last speech, we saw that there was so much optimism that the rally even continued even further. And I think we have still room to continue with this rally further, especially that with the whole backlog of narratives of the cuts happening starting September, and also other central banks starting with cuts. So I think this narrative is really going to support the equity market, and we're still going to continue with it.
What do you think the biggest risk is to equity markets here?
I think persistent inflation.
Yeah.
I think that production costs and wages are going to still negatively affect inflation levels. I think we might see stagflation, not a guarantee and not necessarily, but if we do see, then this will weigh on the economic growth even further. We've already seen slowing economic growth, but I think with stagflation, then we might see some problems arise further.
I thought it was interesting. I saw that you are a gold bull.
Yes.
And gold has reached an all-time high. So obviously your thesis is playing out. Do you expect that to continue as well? And why has gold been doing so well?
Yes, we continue to be bullish on gold. We actually revised our expectations from 2,600 to 2,800 by the end of the year.
Which is where we are right now.
Yes, exactly. We are around 2,400. So yes, gold has already powered through 20% from the start of the year, and I think it should continue. The normal playouts haven't really been the factors serving gold as a safe haven, but Japan retail demand and China as well, central bank for gold reserves are really powering through gold as a safe haven, and as well it has become everyone's favorite.
Yeah, and which explains some of the performances. We have it here up on the screen. Gold up 18% on the year, sitting around 2,400. And of course, your target is 2,800 because of the safe haven bid and foreign reserve diversification. Nadia, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. That was Nadia Bilassy, market analyst at Equiti Group. Thank you for joining us. Well, it's not just gold that's been on our radar as well. Let's get a check on other of the precious metals, industrial metals. You can see copper also having a good run, 2.9%, up 25% of the year. Some supply concerns there driving some of the move upwards. Gold, you mentioned all-time high. And then crude, not yet reacting to some of the geopolitical news over the weekend, but always on our radar. Coming up, South Africa is riding a wave of investor cash ahead of the milestone election. We discuss why and more next. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Iran's Mehr news agency reporting President Ebrahim Raisi and the foreign minister have been killed in a helicopter crash. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman postpones a planned trip to Japan over concerns for King Salman's health. Plus, Asian stocks rally as China moves to shore up its property market. Investors bracing for another busy week of earnings, headlined by AI darling NVIDIA. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi here in Dubai. Dominating news this morning, the death of Iran's president and foreign minister in a helicopter crash in the northwest of the country. We'll have more details in just a moment. But first, let's just get a quick check on how these markets are faring. S&P stronger close on Friday, up 0.1%. 5,300 is where we are at. As we said, Nvidia is going to be the one to watch in terms of earnings that are coming out this week. 10-year yield 4.41%. The market's pricing in around 40 basis points of rate cuts for the rest of the year. Copper in focus, up 2.7% today, 25% for the year. It continues to move higher alongside other metals in the complex, including gold and silver as well. Gold also shown here, up 0.9% at an all-time high. One quick chart I just want to draw your attention to is VIX. Despite the geopolitical premium that we talk about, earnings, Fed cut expectations, VIX is actually sitting at a post-pandemic low. We actually closed through 12% on Friday, and you can see that this is the lowest level it's been since it jumped up to extreme highs through 80 at the beginning of the pandemic. And it tells you, even though we talk a lot about the trajectory of where stock markets are headed from here, volatility isn't pricing in a lot of movement either way. But let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. Avril, what's on your radar this morning?
Yeah, Jumana, I think today it's really about how that risk appetite seems to be getting a bit more cautious, that optimism being sapped in a way as investors keep an eye on developments in the Middle East. We're seeing the stock gauge for the region pairing the gains from earlier of about 0.7%. Tech stocks were running higher at the start of the day. We're seeing the info tech sector now among those declining. So you get a sense of how risk appetite is waning. And it's not just on equities that we're seeing a bit of a move. The traditional safe haven, the yen, is also pairing some of the earlier losses and moving closer towards the 155.7 level now. Chinese property stocks, as you know, Jumana, they've been in focus. They are down today as investors really try and assess just whether the property rescue package is going to be enough. The stocks that are running higher today, the commodities related one, as we see a lot of the metals rising along with crude prices as well, Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much for the overview. That was Avril Hong in Singapore. Returning to our top story this hour, Iran's Mehr news agency says the president, Ebrahim Raisi, and the country's foreign minister have been killed in a helicopter crash. Arabic news channel Al-Alam, broadcasting from Iran, reports all 9 people on board the crashed helicopter are dead. Emergency crews earlier reported seeing wreckage after hours of complicated search efforts. Our Dubai bureau chief, Dana Khresh, joins us for the latest. Dana, a very complex search mission happened throughout the course of the night, and it wasn't until about 2 hours ago that the Red Crescent located the crash site. Not until about half an hour ago that they confirmed that indeed the president was amongst those who were killed in the crash. A huge moment for Iran and for the region.
Yes, it is. And today we saw Press TV, which is an Iranian television channel, broadcasting images from East Azerbaijan, where they are live, showing one cleric was sobbing on the phone, crying, and one of the anchors saying it is a very difficult day for the Islamic Republic of Iran, describing them as both Raisi and Amirabdollahian as servants of the state. So TV channels are in mourning, definitely, and we are now waiting for the announcement to see what would come next in government, that is, what would happen afterwards. And the likelihood is that the Iranian vice president will take over, and he will rule for 50 days until they announce new elections, new presidential elections.
Of course, it seems like it's going to be ultimately the supreme leader's decision, as it always is. Let me just ask you what this may mean, what implications it could have on Iranian foreign policy, because that is the major concern right now.
Right. I would say very limited. Iran's foreign policy, as you said, is set by the supreme leader, and this is an agenda that has been set for decades now, be it Iran's relationship with Israel, and we saw the rockets fired from Iran towards Israel for the first time in its history, and even with the Iran's rapprochement with Saudi and the rest of the region. This has been helmed by Raisi and the foreign minister as well, but this won't change, and I think they will continue to do that because this kind of became in the benefit of them. Now, with Raisi and Amirabdollahian, I think that they may not have been very successful in reviving nuclear talks to ease sanctions on Iran, but even with U.S. policy and the rest, I doubt anything would change with regards to that.
I do think it was interesting that even before the Red Crescent had actually located the site of the crash, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei said the Iranian nation should not be worried or anxious as no disruption will occur to our country's affairs. So he called on the public to pray for those on board the helicopter, but was also reminding the public that at the end of the day, he is still the Supreme Leader, and so they should not expect too much disruption to occur. That's significant.
Indeed.
Dana, thank you so much for joining us. The Bloomberg's Dubai Bureau Chief, Dana Khresh. Well, let's take a further look at the implications for the region here with Amin Saikal, the senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. Good morning to you, sir. Just building on my conversation with my colleague over here, let me just ask you how significant you think this event is for Iran and for the dynamics of the Middle East.
Well, it certainly makes a big hole in the Iranian political leadership. But as your previous speaker said, I don't think it's going to make any substantial change in either Iran's domestic politics or, for that matter, foreign policy. All the powers are deposited in the Supreme Leader, that is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And, of course, he has already assured the Iranian public that the business of the country is running would be as usual and there would be no change. He just simply has called for the people to remain calm and to pray for President Raisi and his foreign minister and some of the others who've been killed in the crash with them. But at the same time, this is going to open the way for a new presidential election, and that election comes at the time that Iran faces serious domestic and foreign policy challenges.
Yeah. So let me just ask you a question about the successor, because President Raisi was deemed one of the two potential successors to the Ayatollah. With him out of the picture now, does that set the stage for Khamenei's son actually to take over? And if that is the case, again, what are the implications from that?
Well, certainly, I think it opens the arena for Mujtaba Khamenei, and Mujtaba has been very closely linked to the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And but that does not necessarily mean that his election is going to be a very smooth election, because he will be challenged by a number of other candidates. Of course, those candidates will be vetted as usual by the Guardian Council for their loyalty and commitment to the preservation and maintenance of the system. But it will remain to be seen who is going to really emerge from the conservative side of politics and, of course, from the reformist side of the politics. My hunch at this point is that I think the authorities under the Supreme Leader will do everything possible that another person who would be very similar to Raisi be elected to the presidency. But whether Mujtaba really too is happy to the ring for the presidency, that remains to be seen, because he's been considered as a serious candidate for succeeding the Supreme Leader. And the Supreme Leader, for the time being, is alive. Of course, he's 85 years old and not in very good health. I mean, at some point, I think that issue will have to be.
Yeah, and this is, of course, coming on the heels of heightened geopolitical sensitivities between Iran and Israel. We saw direct confrontation between the two in the last month. Given some of the turmoil at home, can we expect to see a de-escalation on that front, simply because the Iranian regime is going to be so focused on the internal politics and the upcoming presidential elections, they're not going to have the bandwidth to engage in any external wars?
Well, I mean, that may be really the case, but at the same time, I think Iran is absolutely committed to maintain its regional security complex. And of course, that means that it will respond if there's going to be any attack on the part of Israel or for any of its allies in the region. But let's not really forget that there has been speculation up to this point that Israel or the Israeli intelligence, that the Mossad, which has a very strong presence in Azerbaijan, may be behind this crash. But there is no evidence to really back that up. But at the same time, I think the Iranian intelligence will do everything possible to dig up whatever evidence that could become available. And if there is any evidence of Israeli involvement in one way or another, and then I think the situation between Iran and Israel can get worse than what it is at the moment.
Yeah, very clear. And even back a couple of weeks ago, people were saying if there was going to be another tit-for-tat incident, it would have happened already. Amin, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. A big news day over here in the Middle East. Amin Saikal from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Thank you. Also coming up, South Africa is seeing a wave of investor cash flow ahead of the election. More on that coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Keeping an eye on the developments out of Iran, has been confirmed from the Iranian state agency that the Iranian president alongside the Iranian foreign minister were killed in a helicopter crash overnight. We are also now just getting some latest news from one of the state-run agencies called Noor, saying that the Iranian vice president would now take over as per the constitution. This is the procedure after the president's death. But as we were speaking to our Dubai bureau chief a short while ago, this is part of the procedure. The vice president should take over for the next 50 days, after which an election, in theory, should be held within Iran. But now the state-run agency media, Noor, is confirming that the vice president will indeed take over the role of President Raisi after his death and after he was pronounced dead this morning. Moving elsewhere, South Africa is riding a wave of investor cash ahead of the country's most important election in decades. Money is pouring in on bets that the ruling ANC will avoid being forced by left-leaning coalition partners to implement less market-friendly policies. Let's bring in our finance reporter, Adelaide Shangoli, who is in Johannesburg. And Adelaide, can you just tell us why this election may bring about economic change?
Thank you for having me. So the policy, what has happened now is just investors being excited about the continuation of reforms that have been implemented over the last few years, with the ruling African National Congress now expected potentially to remain in power by garnering enough policies, investor support or enough support from the upcoming elections to win potentially a majority, even if it's not a majority, enough that they will be able to form the next government. So investors are excited about the fact that they will not be seeing some of the left-leaning parties coming in. There was some concern earlier that the ruling coalition would get as low as 38% of the vote, have to partner up with some of the left-leaning political parties, and investors are concerned about seeing things like policies like the expropriation of land, the nationalizing of the South Africa Reserve Bank, and this was very concerning. So news that the ruling coalition, the African National Congress might get as much as 50%, or maybe 45 to 50%. That is exciting investors, and we are seeing quite a bit of inflows into the country's financial markets as a result.
Well, let me just ask you a question about how the international community are actually positioning for the election. I think we're coming off a year where South Africa was not an appealing place to invest, and yet, given what you're saying now, it feels as though investor sentiment has started to change. What do you think positioning is like right now?
So it's quite interesting about that. We've been seeing quite a bit of inflows into the country's bonds market. I mean, I think in April, we've seen the biggest inflow on record since Bloomberg started tracking the data in 2019. We've seen the stock market rallying. The South Africa's currency, the rand, is up. It has erased year-to-date losses. And that gain has lifted South African assets, particularly the locally focused ones. We're seeing bonds, we're seeing the country's banks, we're seeing the retailers doing well. The market is up on a year-to-date basis. So there is quite a bit of upswing and optimism that is being witnessed within the markets.
Adelaide, thank you so much. Adelaide Changoli, our finance reporter in Johannesburg. We will be keeping an eye on what happens with those elections. Well, with the election in South Africa just over a week away, we will be speaking to some key voices from the region on the economic and political stakes. From South Africa now to Rwanda and the Africa CEO Forum, the World Bank's International Finance Corporation signed 9 investment deals during the event in Kigali, valued at around $945 million. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Andira Oganga, who is in Kigali for us. So, Andira, how did the Africa agenda feature at this year's Africa CEO Forum?
Jumana, the opening ceremony was mainly discussing the strides that Africa has made. Take technology, for example. Rwanda is one of the first African countries that is producing the mRNA vaccine. And by that, it has put Africa on the global map in vaccine production. They're also investing in genomics, where they'll be able to produce treatment tailor-made to Africa's healthcare needs. Education was also part of the conversation because there's need to invest in STEM because these are the courses that are driving technology-backed development and also access to talent across the continent. So free movement of these people so that businesses can have the right skill set. However, there are challenges on the continent. 600 million people do not have access to electricity, and this hampers basic economic development. But there are challenges when you want to invest, as was explained by IFC Vice President Mactardio.
And let me just ask you, were there any other themes that also came up in the CEO Forum? What stood out to you?
Well, the closing ceremony, Jumana, it was a bare-knuckle session by businessmen laying it bare on the table, as is one of the issues was connectivity. Africa's richest man, Alhaji Aliko Dangote, saying he still needs 35 visas to be able to travel across the continent. And they still asking for bank statements as opposed to his fellow panelist, who is the CEO of Total Energies, a Frenchman holding a French passport that did not need as much visas. Another issue that actually came up was also taxes. And this was not just a West African issue. Even East African manufacturers are talking about it, and then stable tax policy that we're seeing across the continent, with Alhaji Dangote saying that for every single naira that he turns around, 52% actually goes to government. There are also conversations about the infrastructure needed in Africa, with MTN CEO saying that there need to be $100 billion invested in digital infrastructure to ensure that every African has access to broadband. And this brings into conversation the subject of financing, where Africa needs its own financing infrastructure that will ensure that it reflects the needs and priorities of the continent.
Yep, that's always the big question mark, isn't it? Financing, where are we going to get the funding? Not just for Africa, for everywhere. Bloomberg's Andira Oganga, who is in Kigali. Thank you. Also coming up, we are live in Taipei as the new president calls on China to end the threat of war. More on that story coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersetchi in Dubai. Lai Ching-te has been sworn in as Taiwan's new president today, putting him right at the heart of a rivalry between the U.S. and China. In his inaugural address, Lai says Taipei will maintain the status quo in the Taiwan Strait while urging Beijing to jointly maintain peace in the region. For more, Stephen Engel, our chief North Asia correspondent, joins us live from Taipei. And let me just ask you, Stephen, what stood out to you from that speech? It seems as though a lot of it was actually directed towards China.
Well, absolutely. Cross-strait relations between Taiwan and China are a pivotal issue in this election that was culminated, obviously, in January with the victory by Lai Ching-te. But this was a three-horse race for president, so that kind of watered down the mandate that was won by the former vice president, now President Lai Ching-te. He got just 40% of the vote. So his mandate was a little bit weakened, and he also, his party, the Democratic Progressive Party of the former incumbent, Tsai Ing-wen, essentially lost control of the legislative yuan. So domestically, he might have a bit of a bumpy ride going forward as the opposition KMT uses its position in the legislature to kind of potentially undermine the opening days of Lai Ching-te's term. But the issue across strait is he's not wavering from the DPP, his party's position that Taiwan is essentially, I'm not saying that they're calling for independence, but it's de facto independence. And that was sort of highlighted by his comments in the speech by saying neither China nor Taiwan are subordinate to each other. And that is an issue that Beijing would take great exception to because Beijing feels Taiwan is a renegade province. Now, under Xi Jinping in Beijing, they've obviously said that reunification is a top priority. And through peaceful means is the most preferred choice, but if force is necessary, that could come. So that's why Taiwan, obviously, with the chip supply chain, semiconductors, but also its position geopolitically between China and the United States, it makes Taiwan a critical cog in the geopolitical tension that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no doubt, and around the rest of the world as well, given the significance of TSMC. Thank you. That was Stephen Engel, our chief North Asia correspondent, live from Taipei. Well, and before we go, a quick recap of our top story this morning. Iran's Mir news agency says President Ebrahim Raisi and the country's foreign minister have been killed in a helicopter crash. Arabic news channel Al-Alam, broadcasting from Iran, reports all 9 people on board the crashed helicopter are dead. Emergency crews earlier reported seeing wreckage after hours of complicated search efforts. The nation's vice president will take over under constitutional arrangements with an election to be held in the country. A story that broke last night and one that we will continue to monitor throughout the course of this morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersetchi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe.